Yay!
Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Testers. This is Caitlin Miller. We're both licensed therapists, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. So many. We are typically joined by Marie Moran, who hosts for us. Unfortunately, Marie is not feeling well today, so hopefully she'll feel better soon. Mm-hmm. And it's just the two of us. This is not therapy. It is just an open conversation. It's just us having conversations that we find interesting for 1 hour a week, but also making it available for anyone to join. Mm-hmm. If you're here, good to be with you. Mm-hmm. And if you're in the chat, anything that you write, we'll see, and it will impact us. And yes, that can be questions and answers, but it's just if you're in the chat, conversation. Caitlin was putting the stream up on her phone so I can
see the comments.
Right. Yeah. We work at a practice called Effective Artistry in Northbrook, Illinois. We provide individual, couples, and family therapy to people who live in the state of Illinois. We also work with a few executive functioning coaches that can work with people all over the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's mostly it.
That's mostly it.
We're here. You're here. Tell us something. Caitlin and I, we always have fun conversations, but I like it when people are
it's fun, yeah,
participating and kind of guiding us. Otherwise, we can just kind of go wherever, which is fun too. Mm-hmm. But I worry.
I enjoy both.
Yeah.
What do you worry?
I worry that it's less accessible or relevant when it's just you and I talking about stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, welcome. Please feel free to pop stuff in the chat. We don't have a topic selected for today. We typically try to do that so that the advice I got when I first started the stream was that it's really hard for people to join a stream where there's just like nothing going on and like feeling responsibility. Because I wanted it to be open and like we're here to talk about whatever people want to talk about. But that was good advice, I think. And so that's why we picked topics.
Well, I'd be happy to pick topics ahead of time. My impression was that you didn't want us to pick topics ahead of time.
Oh, no, I love picking topics. I don't pick topics ahead of time because I just don't care to.
No, I would love to. But then what happens? Does Marie like put it on social media or something?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, there have been times in the past where we get a real specific topic. I love those ones where it's like cleaning your house, like that's the topic. And we solicited questions from people about what are the things that you struggle with. And then we can get, because I say a lot that general questions get general answers and specific questions get specific answers. And that the more general something is, the more frequently it applies, like the more cases to which that general way of talking about something is applicable.
Yeah.
But the less impactful it is to any given one of those cases. To apply to two things, you have to leave off some information that would isolate it to just one, and to apply to 3 or 10 or. So when we're talking kind of more generically, just at the internet to whatever millions and millions of people that watch this
hundreds of millions
every day,
billions.
Yeah. Then it has a tendency to be more generic. But when there's somebody in the chat saying like, here's my specific concern or thought or question, then we can get more specific.
Yeah.
So it was fun to do ones like that. And it's been a while where it was like very practical questions and suggestions.
Yeah, I think it would be great. I'm definitely not willing to do it, but to have someone ask social media things and see if people say this is what I want to hear about.
Amy, who is also a counselor, a therapist here, is asking what flavor cookie I'm eating. And I don't know, but it has sprinkles, so I assume it's some kind of birthday cake flavor. That's not. Caitlin brought cookies into the office today. Is that right? Birthday cake?
I don't know if I'm willing to engage with Amy. I'm just kidding. It's funfetti.
She's on the other side of this wall, so she might hear us. Funfetti?
Yeah, it's called funfetti, which is essentially birthday cake. It's like the classic birthday cake.
It's a delicious cookie. It's very dense. It does almost feel like eating cookie dough.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
It's delicious, but I feel like it's going to sit in my stomach like a brick.
I can't see the comments, so you're just going to have to read them to me.
Okay, will do. What should we talk about? What's on your mind?
Let's see. Artistic output, artistic identity, burnout.
I'd say more about
hedonic pleasure.
Those are all general statements. Give me some specific about any one of those things.
I don't know. I mean, you've alluded to this in the past, but it would be nice at some point to talk about identity formation around being an artist. I don't know. I think that.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting.
I'm trying to think of things that are applicable to my clients.
Right. If there's a specific thing coming up with a specific client, obviously changing the details and masking information, whatever, but it would be helpful to know that. Or we can talk with generics.
Well, I think a general conundrum that some of my clients will get into is that they have skill in an artistic medium. They have a certain amount of artistic output and productivity in their past. However, they feel some level of like blockage or lack of productivity as compared to either like a capital P professional or someone that they would deem like more successful than them. And so they are in a rut.
In a rut meaning they're doing the same thing, they're making the same kind of art over and over, or they're not making as much art as they want to be?
Always they're not making as much art as they want to be. However, I don't know. I have some clients who talk about like being completely blocked, like just not being able to do anything. And then other clients who feel as though the things they pay attention to and the things they're working on aren't enough in some way. And usually that's either this isn't a high enough quality, or I'm not producing enough things or finishing enough things.
Yeah. There's just so much in so many different directions. I'll say this because, I like to define things, right? Mm-hmm. And what is art is a big question that impacts this whole conversation. Mm-hmm. So I have a definition to me of what art is.
Brandon, what is art?
To me, it is useful to think of art as anything. So more broadly, communication. I define communication as anything that one person does with the intent of impacting another person or other people the way that they think, feel, or behave. And obviously we impact people all the time without intending to or whatever. So that's separate from what I would call communication, is I am explicitly intending to impact you in some way. To me, art then is communication where the recipient is unspecified.
Interesting.
So as normally when I'm talking to you, right, I'm doing something to impact you in a particular way, whatever I'm aiming at. Or if we're talking on the stream, then it's a little bit more into that art category where I'm trying to impact the kind of person who would be watching the stream in a particular kind of a way. And it's more general. Yeah. So that to me is art, something which is created with the intention of being shared with an audience. Not a specific, if I'm writing something for you, that's a letter or a note, and I wouldn't call that art, even though it can have many beautiful things and can be artistic.
Well, I'll have clients who are artists produce things for specific, like maybe demographics or life experiences in an audience, but that they don't know the specific people who will go to take in the art.
Well, and I think that's what ends up getting in people's way when they're stuck more often than not. There's obviously bunch of different cases, but
you know what, Brandon? I'm going to make this about myself so you can ask specific questions.
Cool.
Brandon, I would like to write more poetry. How can you help me?
Well,
because I'll know how to answer all the specifics.
Are you sure you're okay with doing it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just tell me if it's getting to be something you don't want to do.
It's super helpful. It's a great example because I think that some of my poetry is compelling. I have no training in it, and it is something that I love doing but get blocked with, like, oh my gosh, is this good enough?
Okay, so because of the questions you were asking earlier, I'm gonna ask this question first.
Okay.
Would you call yourself a poet?
I will challenge myself to say yes.
Would you though?
To people who...
If someone said, "Are you a poet?" would you say yes?
Oh. It depends on the person asking.
Okay.
I think if most of the people who already know me in my life asked me, I would say yes.
And so what is it that makes you a poet or not a poet if sometimes you're saying no?
Man, you're so helpful. Even in like question number 3.
Well, just
were you born this way, or maybe it's Maybelline?
It's definitely Maybelline. No, it's the same stuff we always talk about is language and listening.
Yeah.
And you were talking about identity.
Okay, can you repeat the last question? It was great, but I just got.
What is it that you would identify makes a person a poet? That sometimes you are and sometimes you aren't, depending on who's asking.
I would say evolved Caitlin would say anyone is a poet who loves writing poetry. They gain.
That's great, but don't give me the answer that you think is the better answer, like evolved Caitlin would say. Answer with what
sometimes
your real
I'm
answer.
Evolved Caitlin.
Well, I know, but the fact that you're framing it that way is what you're saying is, I think it's useful to think of it this way, but it's not always the way.
Okay, I'll divide it into 2 categories. I would tell the outside world, anyone who enjoys writing poetry is a poet, published or not, any level, whatever it is. To myself, I think I'm still stuck on hitting some sort of standard before allowing myself to associate a label with it.
So I'm going to take it away from asking you specific questions right now and give a little more like generic overview of what I think about this stuff. Yeah. Because I think of art as community, like I am doing something with the intention of impacting other people, but those people are not people that I know.
Thank you.
Like it's not an individual specific person or group of people, even though I might think it's for a certain kind of person or whatever. Somebody who's drawn to doing that, who's wanting to do art, is somebody who thinks a lot about other people and how they respond to things. Otherwise, why would you be doing something? In fact, even if you wanted to, how would you be able to create something with the idea of sharing it with an audience and impacting people later if you didn't pay attention to how people were impacted by things? And
a lot of my poetry is about like being a woman. And so when I write it, I feel like I'm writing it as sort of like a, hey other women, I see you and I feel you.
Right, you have to write to somebody. And sometimes you're writing it to yourself or a younger version of yourself or a specific individual, even though you're really intending on it being for more than just that individual. You identify it that way in order to enable. But you're writing something to somebody. You are aiming to have some kind of an impact. I think a big part of what gets people stuck, especially later, because skill, even though that's a thing and it's worth talking about and recognizing, whatever, it is not inherent to art any more than it's inherent to communication.
Tell me more about that. What do you mean by inherent?
Meaning, people will say things like there are objective rules to what makes art good or bad, for example. And that's just definitely not true.
Yeah, definitely not true.
That unless by good or bad you mean in the estimation of a specific group of people or as defined by a certain specific set of criteria, in which case, yes, when you're using specific criteria, there are specific criteria. But if what you're meaning is it impacts people, there are rules, there are objective rules about what impacts people, like more strongly or whatever. Absolutely untrue.
Yeah.
There are tendencies and trends, certainly, in the same way that any of the stuff we're talking about, where you could say like, oh, if you had to randomly guess, does a person like French fries or whatever, then it's probably a safer guess to say yes than to say no, but that doesn't mean that everybody likes French fries, right?
Yeah.
So there are trends and tendencies and blah, 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 but there are no rules. Humans did not start singing in a way that is competitive and ranking their abilities to sing against other people. Even the pentatonic scale, which is like the foundation of Western music, really, that is a cultural creation. Other cultures don't use that scale and make music that to someone who is raised and their ear is trained on the Western style of music, you listen to like traditional Indonesian music, for example, and it'll be like, oh, that's atonal or
oh, I love it, but
it sounds like
different.
So
and sometimes so different that people are like, ooh, like so like sort of foreign to the way their brains naturally organize music and chordal structures.
Right. So without getting into too much detail about the cycle of fifths and keys and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, generally people who are raised in Western culture will recognize when someone hits a note that is off key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The fact that it is identified as being off key and is therefore like, ooh, that doesn't sound good, or ooh, that person messed up, that is a cultural construct, which is fine. There is stuff about the way that we organize music that is useful and blah blah blah. Some really interesting stuff, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
But when ancient humans, proto-humans, started singing, there was no idea of doing it correctly or incorrectly, or better or worse than other people. It's just a thing that you do to communicate or express yourself, or just because. In fact, it's quite possible that just the experience of generating vibration with your own vocal cords, whether speaking or singing, is in and of itself soothing to a person. And et cetera, et cetera. So this idea that you're good at or bad at things is not inherent to the experience of creating art. Children don't dance because they are good at it or want to become good at it or whatever. They're just dancing. It's just a thing that you do. It's as silly as saying, oh, I'm a really good breather, or being like, oh, I'm not a good enough breather. Everybody dances in some way. Everybody sings or writes poetry or whatever in some way. So we're marrying these concepts with this new, like, well, relatively in the history of our species, new idea of professionalism, competition.
Yeah.
And so what'll happen a lot is that people who are artistic or enjoy making art, they'll do that very young. They'll start at a young age, really love it, and start to dedicate themselves to it more and more. And at some point along the way, usually in like middle school, high school age in our culture, they start to identify as, oh, this is something I want to do to make a living. And once that happens, you start looking at the art differently, because now in addition to just making something that you would like people to experience or that you think would impact people or whatever, which I should say, the thought of, oh, I hope someone thinks this is cool is an impact, right? Like, you know, the John Wick movies or whatever, which I quite enjoy, the ones that I've seen anyway. It's not like something I rewatch a lot, but it's enjoyable. It doesn't mean art doesn't have to be this big, oh, I'm trying to make people think very deeply about this, or it can be that. But when a kid's just drawing a cool superhero that they want to show someone and they'll think it's cool, when I like, that's part of it, right?
That counts as an impact.
Right. So once you start thinking of it as I am or want to be a professional artist, things start to get all kinds of
wacky.
Yeah, things change. Because then it's not just what do I want to make or what do I want to like impact people. Then it gets into what will sell and what do people want to see from me, which breaks, I think, fundamentally what art is. Yeah. And I'm being really philosophical, but
I'm loving this.
Art is meant to be. In fact, just earlier today, I was reading an article about an interview with what I think is one of the most genius artists of our age, George Lucas. And I don't mean that facetiously. Where he's talking about the prequel trilogy, which are, when they came out, people hated them and it became very in vogue. The prequel trilogy of Star Wars, like episodes 1, 2, and 3. That it's almost like if you say you like them, then you're wrong kind of thing.
Wow.
Although that's starting to change now that enough time has passed. But in talking about it, he said things that I actually, when I work with artists, I say all the time, which is you have to make something that you think is worth sharing. Because if you're trying to make something that you think other people will like, there's only really one way of testing that, which is showing it to other people and seeing what they think. But once you start thinking, I can't show something to somebody unless they'll like it, unless I feel like they'll like it.
Well, you're not a fortune teller.
You're using your mental models of people. And you very quickly, even if you're like, okay, some people would like this, or maybe even my family or my friends or my fans might like this. Well, like we've talked about cognition, if it's like, oh, this is no problem, then you stop thinking about that possibility. Oh, but some people might hate it. Okay, well, then what would I do? So the longer you think about it without testing it, the more you start thinking of people who would hate what you're doing. And then you go and you edit it and you change it to address the concern that that person in your head that you just made up might have and make it more palatable or enjoyable for them. But that change makes it less enjoyable for someone else, including potentially the people who already like your stuff. I think a big part of the issue is that people get the narrative backwards. They look at famous and successful artists and they think, wow, how did they become who they were? Like Stephen King was a child who aimed at, that's the kind of person I'm going to be, and then engaged in some habits and some work to become that. That's not what art is. Art is you just make something and you share it. And the more stuff you share and the more visible and easy to access that you make it, the more that people are going to see it. And some subset of those people are going to like it. And some subset of those people are not, right? I mean, that's binary. It's obviously, there could be
but that's
more
a helpful
different impact.
delineation.
The way that you get a following is by just putting stuff out there over and over and over and over. Because if I see something, if I watch a TV
this
show,
is not therapy hour.
Yeah. If I watch a show and I'm like, oh, this show sucks, I just stop watching the show. I don't come back to the next episode and be like, oh yeah, and then start like going after the creator, which is what artists get in their head a lot. It's like, oh, people are going to come after me. They're going to hate. No, if they don't like your stuff, they just stop paying attention to you.
Well, but with like social media, sometimes people say mean things or whatever. But
sure, sometimes people say mean things. And the only way to make it so that nobody could ever say anything mean about you is to make it
hide, to never make it.
So then, I wonder why people might stop working on their art. And then they shift it into being about, oh, I'm struggling to be productive and whatever. And there are valid things to explore. But a lot of the time it's, I don't want to put art out there because it's too scary, which is valid and fine. Which brings us back to the identity piece at the beginning. If you share a piece of art with a single person, that's art. Hell, if you share the art with no one, but you create it with the intention of it being shared, it's still art. And you are therefore an artist. But once you lose track of that and you start getting it muddled up with I get paid or I am good enough or whatever, then all of a sudden you struggle to identify whether you're an artist or not. And then when you go to sit and make some art, before you can even do that, you have this other step where you're like, I got to think about, am I really an artist? And you can't really resolve that, so you never get around to making art.
Something that, do you want to read the comment? Or
it's a spam comment.
Oh, it is?
Want to offer promotion of your channel, etc.
Oh.
Funny timing though when I'm talking about putting stuff out there.
One of the what was I thinking? Oh, one of the things that I notice a lot of writers getting stuck in is the publishing industry, and like, should I try to get sort of an official publishing company to do this? Should I self-publish? Should I publish at all? Should I just put it on social media?
This is a person who already has a completed and ready to publish work. Or someone who's thinking about trying to make something like that.
Let's use an example. Okay, let's go back to me because I have all the specific responses. I have a lot of poetry that I could theoretically share with other human beings.
Do you want to?
I believe so. Is that Amy again?
Yes, it is. She says, going back to the "Are you a poet" concept, I wonder what the two of you think about the additional implications of the perception of the asker of the question too. Clarify for me, Amy, I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Are you a poet?
I think I have a guess of what she means.
The two of you think about the individual. Oh, meaning that you're trying to guess what the person asking the question means by poet?
Well, I immediately thought of like power differentials too. Like maybe if a teacher is asking you, are you a poet, versus a friend, versus a published poet, versus...
Sure, I don't know, and but that would impact...
Oh, she responded.
I believe someone will also believe I'm a poet. If I believe someone will also believe I'm a poet, I will say yes. So to me, that's language, right? That what someone means when they say I am a poet or X person is or is not a poet is different from what someone else means when they say it. And therefore, if you're answering differently in different contexts, like Amy's talking about, what you're doing is trying to guess. When they say, are you a poet, what do they mean? Do they mean, are you a published poet? And if you think that that's what they mean, then you'll say no. Do they mean, do you write poetry? And if that's what you think they mean, then you'll say yes. So you're trying to guess what they mean, which, yeah, absolutely. If I worry they won't agree, I might say no because it seems like imposterish. Yeah, in that case, to me, the most helpful thing, depending on the context, not always worth doing, right? But would be to say, well, what do you mean by poet? If that's what you're trying to do, is guess what they like. Do you mean professional poet or whatever?
Yeah, and I might respond, if I don't want to ask that question, with like, I love writing poetry. I've loved writing poetry for a very long time. I've never really officially shared it, and I would like to sometime in the future, which is sort of me saying what I mean by poet.
So if you would like to share it, then you share it.
Oh!
But if you would not like to share it, then you don't.
Yeah.
Whether
Can
or not,
you say what you mean by liked to share it? Like to
if
share
you
it?
want to.
Can you define? We've needed to do this for weeks, Brandon.
That's a
What
good
do
point.
you mean by want?
If the idea of sharing it seems enjoyable to you.
For me, it's that the idea of sharing it, if it's received well, seems enjoyable.
Well,
The idea of sharing it, if it's received poorly, does not seem enjoyable.
That's understandable.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the way you're thinking of it, you're just not going to share it.
Yeah, that's what's been happening.
Right. Well, I was talking about that George Lucas interview,
Yeah.
where people like hated those prequels, and effectively he says, like, no matter what I make, that the hype for Star Wars has gotten to the point where no matter what movie I make for this episode 1,
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to satisfy everybody.
Oh yeah.
So the only way I can make a movie at all is to think about, what do I want it to be? What do I like?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm trying to make it what people will like, there is no answer to that question.
And I've heard there was like an Elizabeth Gilbert interview, and she was talking about after her like most famous book writing the next one. She said it was like paralyzing. Like once an author has a really successful book, that it's like, what do I do next?
I do think if and this isn't the only way to engage with and create art, but if your intention is to make art to share,
mm-hmm.
with or without the idea of becoming a professional or known or whatever, but you actually want to get it out there and have people see it.
Mm-hmm.
If that is the case, there's only one way to determine whether or not it's ready to share, which is to say, do I feel like it's ready to share, right? Mm-hmm. And if that's and I have some specifics here that we'll get to in a second, but if the way that you're thinking, is it ready to share, is, will people like it? You will never say yes to that question, because mm-hmm. there cannot be a thing that anyone will like.
Well, and also I think a lot of neurodivergent people, including myself, usually assume, I don't know why, that maybe people will like things less than they end up liking them.
You know how I feel about neurodivergent and whatever, but I would argue that depending on how you're describing and measuring neurodivergence, that mm-hmm. being neurodivergent and being an artist are almost synonymous.
Yeah. Almost all of my clients who identify as neurodivergent are either creative scientists or like creative.
Well, the experience of being neurodivergent is having some experience, whatever other particular experiences, it entails at least having an experience of feeling as though you see things differently than other people, or experience things differently than other people in some impactful mm-hmm. way.
Yeah.
And when it comes to being creative, well, to do something that other people haven't already done, mm-hmm. to share a perspective that other people haven't already shared, again, by definition, you are looking at that thing differently than others who have mm-hmm. looked at that thing. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm trying to be careful about. I'm not saying all artists are neurodivergent or vice versa, but
no absolutes on this train.
But
other than be nice to yourself. That's the only absolute.
Another way of saying this is, if you really create art mm-hmm. that bothers no one, that no one dislikes, which is impossible, literally impossible.
Yeah.
Right. Look at the art that you would think of as the most inoffensive, popcorn, like made to appeal to everyone. Mm-hmm. Like people will have this criticism of Marvel movies, for example, and look right there, people have that criticism mm-hmm. of Marvel. Even if you're making something that the vast majority of people really enjoy, some people are going to dislike it.
Do you think part of what I'm doing then is overestimating the negative impact on me of the people who will inevitably not like things that I share that I deem to be art?
My frustrating answer is no, you are exactly correctly estimating it, because those people, who are only people in your head at this point, are literally preventing you from making art.
I'm not tracking how that's an answer to my question, which is very interesting.
You're saying, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but let me say back what I heard your question to be. that you were asking, do you think I'm overly estimating the impact it will have on me for people that negatively respond to my art?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that those people, even though they don't actually exist yet,
Mm-hmm.
they theoretically will or do or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
those people are already impacting you to the point that you aren't making or sharing your art.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't overestimate that. They're impacting you so much that you're literally not doing
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a helpful distinction, that like these people, to remind people that these people technically do not exist.
it. Yeah. Well, and it's tricky because they do, right? Like if you put something out there, some people will dislike
Well, I
it.
would say almost like archetypes of them exist.
Right. They're not real yet,
Yeah.
even though real people will exist who
Yeah.
will respond
Who
in
don't
that
like
way.
it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, to be an artist, to put art out, you have to accept that some people will not like it.
Well, and then there's also like the category of art that I tend to become attracted to is stuff that usually the people are dead now, and that when it was put out, it was pretty controversial and they got a lot of shit for it.
Sure.
So it's like,
And that's definitely true. And I would say that there's a correlation between the more impactful the content of your art, like the more meaningful your art is to some people, the greater the
dislike
distaste or even hatred will be from other people. Like to make something which nobody really dislikes, like at worst they don't really give a crap about it, is also making something that nobody's really going to love either. Just general and specific, right? But if you make something that speaks to someone in an incredibly deep and impactful way, someone else will hate it that deeply. Like when you advocate, if you're going to try and speak to women and be helpful to them in your poetry,
and
there are
like
going to be lots of people that don't want you to speak to women that way. If you have a cause, if you are championing the Palestinian cause, there are a lot of people who are going to hate everything you're doing. If you're championing the pro-Israeli cause, then there are going to be a lot of people who hate what you're doing. The only way to not have that is to just not do anything. And I don't want to make this sound like it's all psychological, but I do think this gets in the way a lot. I think there are other things too. But here's my practical suggestion. The idea, is this ready to share with the public at large? That question, saying yes to that is something you're never going to do. You will never, ever say, yes, this is ready to share with the public at large.
Why?
Because, like we just talked about, for one, the public at large means everyone, and you will always envision people who would hate it.
Yeah, okay.
So you'll never say everyone will like it. But also, the act of creating a piece of art is something which gives you with experience with both creating and observing and critiquing that art. By the time you're done writing a poem, you are, quote unquote, a better poet than you were when you wrote it. Which is part of the reason I think that artists will create something and really love it and then look at it 2 weeks later and be like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. How could I ever think that this was good, even though I did at that time?
And I've heard artists in interviews too be like, oh, the art I was doing, maybe let's say they're 50, like the art I was doing when I was 25, I look back at it and I think it's so awful and simplistic, but it was also my most famous art.
Well, and not only most famous, but there are some fans, like musicians in particular, I've heard this interview a lot, some version of this interview, right? That there are some fans that are like, yes, the stuff you put out when you were 20 is brilliant and the stuff you make now sucks. Where the artist themselves will say, the stuff I make now is way better than what I make, which only reinforces the point that different people respond differently. And if you're trying to decide whether or not to share art based on will people like it, people like different things. You will like things that you will put out there and other people won't like them. You will dislike things. You'll put something out there, people will love it, and you'll come to hate it, but people love it.
Yeah. I think one of the things that gets a lot of artists kind of stuck, though, is once they have something that is well liked, if they never reach what they perceive that level of well liked is again, then they feel as though they are a failure.
Yeah, well, that comes back to they're just asking that question, will people like it? They might have refined it now to, will people like it as much as they liked my earlier stuff? Or will my fans, the people who liked my earlier stuff, like this as much as they like the old thing? Which, no, they won't. You know, like if I love a book, I love that book. I don't love you, the author who made the book.
Mm-hmm.
I love that book. Your next book is a different book.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that I will love that book even more or the same as the one that I did.
Mm-hmm.
But statistically, on balance, the people who love your work the most, like that particular specific work, impacted them in a particular specific way that is unlikely to be replicated by any other art, even your own art in the future.
Yeah.
I think there's an exception to that, a very notable one, especially with what I think is relevant for like people like Taylor Swift, where we come to identify with the artist and the artist's narrative becomes important to us. The fact that she went through this or she's hitting this phase in her life, that is meaningful to me. But if we were to
so
just
are
look
you
at
saying
the
that
art,
in some ways identifying the artist and them hitting those times in life that it almost like supersedes whatever the reaction to the art would be regardless of the identifying with the artist?
or that it's a factor of how it impacts you, right? That even if, and I'm using Taylor Swift because to me that's somebody who, it seems like there's a lot of this where people have kind of almost a relationship and like are rooting for her and things like that.
Yeah.
But I'm not actually very familiar with her work, which maybe people will judge me for that.
No,
but
a lot of
if you were to take one of her earlier albums and one of her more recent albums and show them to people as though it's two different artists, then some of those people are going to like the earlier one better than the later one. But if you say it to people that it's both the same artist and they liked that first one, they are more likely than to like the second one too, because they like the journey that they're on with the artist.
Yeah.
Which is also why people can feel very betrayed by artists.
What did she say?
She said, I was thinking of T Swift while you were both talking, so you're spot on. I do want to give practical. Okay, so you can't answer the question, is this ready for the public? You can't. It will always be a no. And you can put it out there even though you're saying no, but then what's the criteria you're using? Here are the two things that I would suggest to people. One, and this is more nebulous and risky, but easier, easier and is in like lower cost, is to say, do I like this? And set yourself a rule that if I like this, I share it. Now that to go straight to the public is still a big thing to say, well, I like it, so I'm going to let anybody see it. That's what we're doing on the stream, right? Like I'm okay with what I'm saying. I'm open to criticism and feedback and will respond and whatever, but I'm fine with anybody seeing it because as long as I'm okay with what I'm saying, I don't care who sees it. If people I understand some people won't like it and will have problems with it, and that's okay. Yeah. The other, and this is a more practical thing for most people who are trying to be professional artists. The other way to do it, I split it into, and I'm not the only one who uses these terms, obviously, but I'll define them. Alpha audience, beta audience, and then wide release. You want an alpha audience, you want some beta audience, and then there's just releasing it to the public. And each step of the way, the question is, do I think I'm ready? Do I like it enough to share it with my alpha audience? And when the next step is, does the alpha audience think it's ready to share with the beta audience? And then does the beta audience think it's ready to share with the public? And alpha for me is this. It is a person about whose opinions, like artistically, you don't necessarily care very much, right? Like your mom.
Interesting.
Right, like they might not care, like my wife. I love my wife. She and I have different tastes. Yeah. So a book that I love, she's going to say, this is not enjoyable to me or whatever, right? Yeah. So it doesn't matter. Your alpha audience can be someone who shares some taste and you care about whatever, but that's not the important part. The important part of who your alpha audience is that it is a person or people that you have zero worry that their perception of you or your relationship with them will be impacted by their experience of your art.
I don't know if there's anyone in my life.
So that's where you got to work, right? Meaning they could read it and think it's crappy. They won't like you any less.
Yeah, I think what I'm more worried about is they read it and think it's great, and then it changes the relationship.
If they think it's great, then that's when they're saying, okay, share it with your beta readers.
Okay, who's beta?
Beta is a larger group of people, and they are people who are either intended audience members. Like established authors have beta readers that are primarily composed of fans of their existing work, right?
Yeah.
Beta readers, beta audience are the people that represent the group of people you are trying to impact.
Okay. Yeah.
So if I'm an author, I'm going to share my writing with my wife, who doesn't like the kinds of books that I am writing, but does love me. And she can read it and give me feedback about, look, this isn't my taste, but it seems like this, share it with your beta. Or sometimes can say, I don't know, are you sure you're ready to share this with the beta? Like, this seems confusing to me, or whatever, right? The alpha audience is really more a reflection of, they're just trying to make their guesses about whether you feel good with sharing it. They're a reflection of yourself.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. That's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just people that you're safe with. Where beta readers actually care about the art you're making specifically.
Yeah.
And that if they didn't like the art you were making, like, their feedback is valuable. And I have specific ways of helping artists.
Are you saying, like, if you had like 10 beta readers and 7 of them were like, this doesn't even seem like your last book, what are you talking about, or something like that?
Sure, but it would be more likely for them to say things like, this arc is confusing to me, or like,
they follow it in a way that,
right, or like, that character is really tropey. I feel like that's the same character I've seen in a million other things. And I have specifics on how to get feedback that is like particularly useful and whatever, that I would teach people. One of these days I'll do like an artist workshop, serious things. But anyway, that to me is the easiest in terms of just figuring out when is it time to share. That you have an alpha reader, alpha audience, listener, whatever, viewer. That's just someone that you show, like what in film they would call the dailies. Like, just whatever work you did that day, you show it to them at the end of the day. And then with their approval of like, yeah, you should share this with other people. Even if your response is like, no, it's not ready. If they say it's ready, you share it with the beta audience. And then when the beta audience says, yeah, this is great, you should share it. Even if you are like, no, it's not ready. If they say it is, then you share it. So it's kind of an in-between, as opposed to saying, am I ready to share it or whatever. It's a smaller step each way. Am I ready to show it to this person who I'm safe with? So it's a low bar. And then they're going to have a higher opinion of you and not be as worried, and you share your poetry with me. I'll be impacted by it in whatever way I am. I am not going to spend my time and energy the way that you do imagining people who might hate it.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense.
I'm not going to respond to it.
It's almost like you think human beings grow within community.
Well, that's kind of, to me, the point of art.
Yeah.
A big part of the reason that people are struggling to make this art, like, the value of art is it is asynchronous communication. I am creating a thing with the intent of impacting other people, with no expectation that those people will then respond to me or impact me in turn in some way.
Yeah.
So it's wonderful communication at scale. It's why art like lasts through, there's art that you and I observe and are impacted by that was created by people who don't speak the same language, don't understand our culture, don't know. We don't have to have the same touch points. It's a large scale communication, which is the downside too. I'm a big fan of the death of the author way of going about this, that the work is independent of the person who created it, in large part for that reason. Like, do I really care what Shakespeare was trying to do when he wrote such and such, or do I really just care how such and such impacts me?
Yeah.
And it gets muddy because sometimes the idea, like, I think of Magritte this way a lot, that getting a sense of how they were trying to impact you is part of the experience of the art. So I think the artist's intent does matter to some extent, but it depends on the work. The more conceptual the work is, the more you care about what the artist meant by it.
Can you say what you mean by conceptual?
Well, I think art happens in phases. This is another identity thing, right? And the actual, like, creation of the art, meaning turning it into something which physically exists and can be observed by other people, is the last step. Coming up with the idea of it is an earlier step. I think the very first step is just experiencing the world and taking in information, and then kind of letting that sit and whatever. And then there are different processes by which you can focus the kinds of data you're taking in, the kinds of experience you're exposing yourself to increase the likelihood. But you take in information, and then things kind of mix, and then connections happen and ideas come, and there are things you could do to make that happen more frequently. Then once you have the idea of what it is what impact you're trying to have on the audience, and what it is that you're going to do to try and have that impact on them, then you work on creating it, crafting it, making it exist in reality. So I think it is entirely valid. In fact, I think it's important for people to say, yes, I'm a poet, even though I don't actually write my poetry down. Or I am a musician, even though I don't actually record my music. Or I am a painter, even though I'm not actually painting. Because otherwise, that identity becomes too unstable. Like, I only retain validity as an artist while I'm actively making art.
And let me tell you that I've seen so many people spiral.
Right. As soon as they struggle, and there are many reasons to struggle, and we've mostly focused on just the one today. But there are many reasons that a person might not be making much art or any art at all for a period of time.
Yeah.
If in response to that, which is happening for a reason, they panic and say, oh, I'm no longer an artist. I am blocked. I'm whatever.
Yeah.
Then now, like I said, the next time they sit down to write their poetry, first, they got to have this whole conversation in their head of, are they even a poet anymore? Which is very difficult to resolve, and really gets into whatever spare resources you have to write poetry are going to get consumed by the conversation of, am I a poet?
I mean, you can even say 60 seconds after writing a great poem, you can be like, oh, I'm no longer a poet.
Right.
You could just dissolve at any point.
It's the same thing as basing it off of whether other people or how many other people like it, or to what extent, or whether they pay for it, or whatever. If you base it on that, then that's going to fluctuate. And it's going to cause you an identity crisis anytime you put something out there that somebody doesn't like, which is a lot of what is happening in the version we're talking about today, where it's like, oh, if someone says they don't like it, that makes me think I am not a poet, which is a big deal. Instead of, no, I am a poet, and some people don't like my work, and some people do. And honestly, the most successful artists in the history of our species, it's still the people who like it are like the tiniest fraction of a percentage of all people. You don't need to make something that most people like. You just need to make something and share it that somebody, and you ask any artist, if you say, let's say you create some art and you put it out there and one person likes it. And I'm not even saying like their life is changed by it. I'm just saying they sit and they listen to your album for an hour and they're like, this is great. And even they never think of it again. Was that still worth it to you to create it and put it out there? And mostly artists will say yes. If one person liked the experience, if it had an impact on a person, then it was worth making it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, what? Do 10% of the people who listen to it have to like it in order for it to be good? 20%, volume, 10,000 people. Just recognize it as communication. You're trying to impact people. And you can't ask, will this impact people in the way that I want to impact them? Because that's the same as, will people like this? You just say, I want to impact people in such and such a way. You make something that you then say, this impacts me in that way. So I think it can impact others in that way, and you share it. What do you think?
153.
All right, I want to at least briefly touch on some of the other things that happen, because I don't want it to end up as like everyone's thinking that the only reason artists struggle to make art is because they're in their head about sharing it and are they good enough?
Absolutely, that is not the only reason.
Right.
Let's just say that out loud.
The other, and to me by far the most common reason that I see with clients and whatever, is because, as we talk about all the time, you are finite. You have a limited pool of resources, and you don't have the resources spare that you need in order to be able to do the work that you want to do.
But I don't need to eat or sleep, Brandon. What are you talking about?
Right. And like you mentioned, a lot of times people say, well, I used to make so much art and blah, blah, blah. And then they'll also in the exact same conversation say, oh, I got a much better job these days than I used to. Well, that job probably is taking resources that it didn't used to take. Are you in a relationship that you weren't in at the time?
Do you have 3 children?
Do you have children that you didn't have at that time? Do you have other responsibilities that you didn't have at that time? Are you
more physically ill than you used to be?
Right. So it's back to, oh, I'm infinite, and therefore doing anything that takes more of my resources should not diminish the extent to which I do this other thing, which also takes resources. And that's just
which kind of reminds me of like Puer Eternus, Peter Pan kind of stuff. But anyway, Amy gave another comment. What does it say?
Resources in all caps. She's yelling. Yes.
I'm like waiting for Amy to bust through the door and be like, "Hello, this is not therapy hour."
In this way, it is much like.
Now she's yelling.
What was that? Resources. She yelled resources through the wall. I'm sure our downstairs neighbors love this part. She said it again. In this,
oh my god.
In this, it is the same as anything else, where a person is not doing something, not because they don't think it's worth doing. They do think the value is greater than the cost. They think it's worth doing, but they can't afford to pay the cost because those resources are taken up by other things or don't exist, whatever. Whenever somebody is in that position, but they make the mistake of thinking that it's the reason they're not doing it is because they don't value it enough. I just don't care about it the way I used to. What's wrong with me? I'm not inspired with it. Whenever it is the value's worth the cost, but I can't afford it. But you think that I think the value isn't worth the cost and that's why I'm not doing it. Then your response to it is to try and increase the value, which not only does not work, because in reality, you already think the value is greater than the cost. It actually makes it harder, because the greater the disparity between the higher value it gets, you already thought it was worth doing and felt bad. You already felt bad for not doing it, which is how you can know that you thought it was worth the cost.
Yeah.
If you're like, oh, this is wrong, I'm doing the wrong thing, what's wrong with me? That means you think it's worth the cost. If it's something where you don't think it's worth doing, then you might say, I wish things were different, or it would be nice if whatever, but you're not like, what's wrong with me? Why am I not doing it? You're already feeling bad. Whatever you do that increases the value, trying to quote unquote motivate yourself, putting your identity on the line. If I don't write, I'm not even a writer anymore. Makes it more valuable. Well, you still can't do it because you still don't have the resources available to pay the cost. And now you feel worse about not doing it. So then you try and increase the value even more, and now you feel worse and more, and you feel worse. And it becomes a cycle of burnout and whatever, where any spare resources you generate are spent on being mean to yourself in your head in an effort to get yourself to do something. So you will never have the spare resources to be able to do that thing, because you're using them up to be mean to yourself. It gets worse and worse and worse. If you are feeling bad about not doing something, you do not need to increase the value of that thing. You need to look at how to either bring the cost down or look at other things in your life that are draining you that you can cut.
Could you give a typical example of an artist who claims they have executive dysfunction regarding making said art?
The vastly, like, million times more common, most common version of this is, I go to work all day and I do my work, and then when I get home at night, I want to make my art and I don't. The resources that you're using to make the art, especially if you're thinking of it in terms of the professional artist, right? A lot of that overlaps with the resources you're using to get through your day at the job. By far the most common thing I hear from artists who are struggling is, I work all day and I do fine. And then when I get home, I just am so unmotivated and I can't get myself to do anything.
So do you think part of it is because they're not equating the executive functioning they're using at their job with the executive functioning they will use making their art? Like, they think of it as like two completely separate things? They
do. And I wouldn't necessarily, I would use slightly different language, but if we say energy is like a pool of resources, they think that there's one pool of energy that's work energy and one pool of energy that's, or more commonly they'll say, I like making art, meaning it's something that gives me energy. And so they don't think they should need energy to be able to do it. But even things which give you energy still require energy to do.
While I have COVID and I'm starving and I'm thirsty, I should be able to make the art.
Right. They think it's about motivation, effectively. That if I'm just motivated enough, like, people believe that we can break the physical laws of the universe, that if you just think in a certain way, you can literally create energy out of nothing, which is not, like, the conservation of energy and conservation. That's not how it works.
What do you mean by energy, Brendan?
In this case,
that was like a Friday conversation.
And we got to get wrapping up because I'm back to back and I can't get running behind too much today. But just, there are things that can be done where you can take things off your plate to conserve resources in that way. There are things that can be done to bring the cost down, either the thing you're attempting to do but failing to do, or the things that you are doing, make them cheaper to do and therefore conserve resources in that way. or to do more things which restore resources to you, give you things back and replenish you. Like in the case of take it off of art and make it about homework, but a very similar thing.
Mm-hmm.
Very common and easy thing is you go to school all day, you come home, you're not doing your homework right after school, and then you beat yourself up and you beat yourself up. Oh, what's wrong with me? I'm procrastinating. And then you finally do it at 10 o'clock at night. A very easy change to make is just plan on doing it at 10 o'clock at night.
Mm-hmm.
And allow yourself in between to engage in all the things that you're engaging in anyway, with the belief that this is the stuff I got drained at school.
Mm-hmm.
Then I do this stuff that replenishes me, and by 10 o'clock, then I'm able to do the homework.
Yeah.
So same thing with the art. Assume that at the end of the workday, I am drained. And then
I'm never drained at the end of my workday, Brendan.
The things that you do then, whether it's scroll social media or watch TV or whatever thing it is that you think is valuable or whatever,
yep.
Recategorize that in your head as I've drained some resources. Now I'm home. Now I do stuff to replenish those resources until it gets to the point where I have enough to do the art. Instead of just thinking if I'm mean enough to myself, as soon as I get home, like I'm going to work tonight. I'm going to do art tonight. I'm going to do it. And then as the time gets closer, it's like, oh, you're wasting all those resources.
Yeah.
And you're not replenishing them to the extent that you would otherwise be. Just, geez, I mean, of all people, artists, please understand, we are finite beings. That's the whole point of art. Why would you be trying to interact with other people if any individual person is infinite? You have limits. Act like it. You're not going to write a novel in a week. You're not going to paint the whole painting in a night or whatever. Maybe you do. I don't know.
Some of my visual artist clients can, but
different people
varies.
do it different ways. But just understand that it is something which takes resource. I'll say, ever been too tired to go to sleep? Right? Like we all have that experience sometimes where it's like, oh, I'm too tired. I'm so tired I can't even get up and go to bed. I'm stuck on the couch watching TV.
Like physically, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I want to go to sleep, but I'm here on the couch doing whatever, and I'm too tired to even get up and go to sleep. It is possible to be so depleted of energy that you can't even do the thing which helps you to restore that energy.
And this is today's version of This Is Not Therapy Hour at 2:02. Thank you for the free therapy, even though this is not therapy.
This is not therapy.
But I found this very helpful.
We didn't talk about you all that much. I would love to talk more about.
So helpful.
I have all like things broken down into 5 categories, the 5 steps of it. Like.
Here we go. Wait. Next week we are going to talk about the 5 steps. 5 categories. And we did not. I just realized our shirts are almost the same color.
Oh yeah.
We did not
and we
plan
both
this.
kind of matched the chairs a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good to be with you.
Yeah. Good to be with you,
Good
Amy Springer.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you all. We'll be here next week. Goodbye.
Now you have to turn off the stream.
All right. Goodbye.
It reminds me of like after the movies when they still cut it off.
Ferris Bueller.
Yeah.